All right. Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Elizabeth Ulmer, Chair of the Board of Accountancy Pipeline Committee. I am calling this public meeting to order. Today is Friday, December 13th, and the time is 12:02 p.m. This meeting is being held via Zoom and video and is being recorded. Please be sure to mute your mic through Zoom. When you want to speak, please raise your hand or use your hand feature if participating by Zoom, and unmute when called upon and mute yourself when done speaking. Committee members, the board liaison, and support staff can ask to speak at any time. For any members of the public observing this meeting on Zoom, please use the public comment opportunity the committee will extend at each meeting unless specifically called upon. Please do not use the chat room for any discussions. Should any technical issues arise, we will pause the meeting until they are resolved. I will now, and I apologize about the dog barking. I have somebody here who I can call on to stop him, but I think we're just going to keep going. Oh my goodness. Now I lost track of where I was. Take a roll call of members and guests, starting with those on with the committee members. Excuse me 1 second. Hazards of all of this. Okay, so I will, let's see, I've lost track of myself yet again. Okay, so Elizabeth Ulmer, Portland State University, and I will turn it to Scott. Present via Zoom.
Present via Zoom, Scott Wright.
Chris?
Chris Dalvig from Linfield University, present via Zoom.
Cynthia?
Cynthia Killingsworth from Portland Community College, present via Zoom.
Logan?
I coughed when you talked. Were you calling me out, Elizabeth?
Yes, Logan.
Oh, great timing. Logan Steele, board liaison, present via Zoom.
Mary?
Mary Savage, University of Oregon.
Claire? Claire's in there, but she might need to introduce herself.
University of Portland, present via.
Great,
Can you hear me, Elizabeth?
Yes, I can. You were a little bit warbly there, but it seems to have gotten better. And from the Board of Accountancy, we have Martin.
Martin Piccioni, present via Zoom.
Andrew. Does Andrew need to introduce himself?
He does, but he.
There we go.
Andrew Barlow, present by Zoom.
Quinn?
Quinn Stoddard, present by Zoom, board staff.
Great, thank you. And we have a number of guests today. Sherry?
Sherry McPherson, Oregon Society of CPAs. Thank you.
Oh, I missed Tana. I'm sorry, I missed, we'll do Tana and we'll come back to board staff. Go ahead, Tana.
Tana Hollis, Oregon Society of CPAs, present via Zoom.
Great. Nicole?
I'm present by Zoom.
Okay. And Melissa?
Yes, it's Melise, actually, Melise Cunningham, Oregon Department of Justice.
Great. I think I got everybody there. Okay, so
Did you get Mary Savage?
I did.
Okay.
I did get Mary. So when I turn to the agenda, Martin, our first order is to introduce Karen Johnson, but I don't see her on the Zoom yet.
Yes, and that's because we've had a magical morphing of assigned staff by the Department of Justice. That was a bit of a miscue because we thought that we would have to work with the contracting side of DOJ, but it turns out we need to work with the tax and finance section of DOJ to advise us on the next steps of this work, which is why Karen Johnson politely turned it over to her esteemed colleague, Melise Cunningham, who is here with us. And what we wanted to introduce her to the committee. And some of you may actually say, wait a minute, didn't we have this name somewhere before? It's like, doesn't this ring a bell? And it would, because Melise is none other than the attorney at DOJ that actually advised us very early on the drafting of the legislation itself for the accounting scholarship. So she actually already knows all the wonderful things that we're trying to accomplish. She was in there early in the fray. We already owe her a debt of gratitude, and she's back for more either joy or punishment, depending on her perspective. So that's why Melissa is here instead of Karen.
Perfect. So that leads into my next question, which is review and adoption of the agenda. Do we need to make a change in any way to this because we have Melissa? Or do we just adopt it subject to that change?
We just adopt it subject to that change. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. Do I have a motion to adopt the agenda subject to the change of attorney?
I make a motion to adopt the agenda as presented, except for the change for attorney.
Do I hear a second?
Second.
Great, thank you. All right, so do we have anything from public comment from our guests?
Madam Chair, shouldn't we vote on that?
We do.
Thank you very much. Yes, do I hear by show of hands to approve the agenda subject to the change?
Aye.
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 Claire? Okay, I saw your hand pop up there on your screen. Okay, thank you. Okay, moving to public comment. Do we have any public comment, or are we going to move right into the work session?
Madam Chair, I don't hear any public comments, so I think we're ready to move straight.
Okay.
This committee is raring to go.
All right, so the first item in our work session is to really bring everybody up to date on the conversation that I had with the board and to just understand what their thoughts were about where we should be going with thinking about how to structure the contract. And what we were really focusing on is trying to understand a couple of key points. And may I share my screen here?
Absolutely.
Okay. All right. So I'll do that in just a second. And so the key points that we talked about is what this would look like in terms of the distribution of funds to scholarship recipients. So in other words, we're going to do an endowment, no endowment, how many scholarships were we seeking to push out there? Just trying to really understand what the board's wishes were so that we can appropriately adopt the contract. So if I share my screen here. What I'd like to share with you is a spreadsheet that Scott, I'm grateful, put this together for us in very little time. Can you all see this spreadsheet? With the pipeline projections, perfect. Yeah. So what Scott did after we had a
Uh-oh.
Dr. Ulmer, you're currently frozen. Your screen's frozen. We can't hear you.
About
Accountancy, this is Stefan.
Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you now. You were skipping around a little bit. Basically, right when you started.
Got it. So we had a lot of conversations about whether there would be an endowment or no endowment. That really seemed to be the first question that we needed to answer. And Scott had prepared these different projections, really because until you see how much $1 million dribbles down into when you start distributing it widely, you can't really understand what the potential impact of this could be. And that's really where we were going, was a conversation with the board about, are we trying to get a faster impact while we have this shortage? Because we don't know what the future is going to bring. Are we trying to create some kind of an endowment that goes into perpetuity? And is there a willingness to create a trade-off between less of an impact now with a longer term impact? And so there was a great deal of discussion from the board about what this was, what they felt was important. And I would not say that there was universal agreement. It was not unanimous that the board felt there should be, that all of this should be spent in a relatively quick time frame. But there was a majority, and a clear majority, that this needed to be pushed out quickly. Logan, do you want to weigh in on any of that?
Yeah, I think that was accurate recall of the board meeting. And also, you know, direction I think is a great direction.
So again, what we're looking at is $1 million as our working estimate of how much is going to be going out. And so Scott had just done a couple of different scenarios here to see what this would look like. So what's really important in each of these is this cell that I just highlighted. So we're looking at Pell eligible students as a proxy for financial need. Although I think there does need to be some language here that not all students who have need are Pell eligible. For example, DACA students are not able to be Pell eligible. So there would have to be some mechanism in the scholarship application. If you are not Pell eligible, is there some other way of evidencing your financial need? So there would be something like that. So this would be, if we were to do this, spreading it equally over 5 cohorts, and I'll explain that in a second. We could do 80 scholarships over a 6-year period. The way to think about this that is really critical, or
Dr. Ulmer, you've appeared
I
to
know.
frozen again.
I looked over at the pictures and everybody else was frozen. Okay, so let me go back a second. One of the things that came out when we had our last meeting, and Cynthia, I'll really credit you to this, is thinking about from an equity perspective. If we do a scholarship one time, those most vulnerable students may not feel that it is as large of a commitment. And so I definitely got a sense from this committee that we felt there was value to doing these as a cohort. So in other words, not just 1 year of scholarship, but that once a student gets a scholarship, there is some kind of a statement in there that this will be renewable subject to. And, you know, we'd have to think about what the subject to is, obviously continuing in the major. So it does reduce the number of students with impact, but I do agree. I did a little noodling around on this afterwards. I absolutely wholeheartedly agree with Cynthia's comment that this creates greater equity. And so I'm happy to move through each of these. I'm not sure what questions folks have on this. I shared this with the board, and it helped frame their discussion. So we did not get to a point where we said exactly how much we would want to grant. We got as far as no endowment, and then that was pretty much time. But you can see we get 80 at $2,500 a year, 40 at $3,000 a year, excuse me, over a longer time horizon. I mean, and we can play with these any way we like. I'm happy to share this or have Martin share this spreadsheet with you. We can do 30 at $5,000 again over a different time horizon. It's just, you guys can do back of the napkin on this as well and see where we're going. The concern, I think, with all of this is the need to demonstrate impact. Some of that is in framing, how it gets reported out. And for example, if you were to say on this 80, that it is, you know, you could say 80 scholarships. It could also be talked about in terms of scholarship years. So years of education. So you can talk about it at the student level. You can talk about it at the years of tuition covered, or, you know, or years of education that this is going towards. So those are 2 different ways of talking about it. One, if you talk at the student level, it's a smaller sounding number. If you talk about it at a scholarship level, it's a lot larger. So I guess at this point, I just would like to turn it back to you guys and see what the thoughts of the committee are on this. And perhaps start with Logan.
So, yeah, measurability and impact. That's, you know, it depends on, I'm not sure how that looks in the end. So it'll be very easy for us to report like on the actuals, like we gave out to X students or X years and then X graduates, right? And I think that like pretty much any methodology we use, will be measurable from that frame, right?
From the outputs, but not from the outputs are a lot trickier.
Yes, and that's what's the incremental output of additional accounting students? Oh, that is inherently hard to measure, and I don't know if anyone has maybe Martin could opine on this. I don't know what we'll be expected to do if we are expected to generate some data to evidence incremental impact. That's gonna be hard. We're gonna have to think carefully about how to do that. If it's a matter of just reporting out like who we've helped and how many graduated, that will be straightforward. So, Martin, do you have any idea on this, or Elizabeth?
I don't on my end. I don't have specific instructions. The only thing I have is what I reported out at the committee previously, is that fortunately without specificity, essentially the expectation from the governor's office was simply described as, we want you to be able to show as much as in any way possible the impact on the pipeline, and specifically also from a perspective of diversity impact on the pipeline. So those are the two. The expectation simply is that there is a measurable outcome of our impact, but it is not specific enough that we're constrained as to how we approach it.
So demographics. Oh yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's exactly where I was going.
Yeah.
It was demographics. I think that's
Yeah.
really that we can't. I think there's actually I would go one step further too. There's absolutely demographic data that we should be able, that needs to be collected. And I made notes on the Washington contract about that, because they don't talk about collecting that. What we're showing is our population that we're funding at least as diverse or more diverse than the population at each of the schools, because the schools have the information for their accounting majors that can be pulled. And so then we can either in aggregate or school by school say, look, this is the population of college students in Oregon. This is who we've scholarshiped. They're at least as diverse or more diverse than the population of students. And we can't even guarantee that. We assume that would be it if we're saying Pell Grant eligible, but we can't guarantee that. The other piece of this, though, with outcomes is I do think there's going to be something that we need to do that needs to be done at the OSCPA end around tracking. And that is, that's tricky. And you're going to have small sample sizes, but I do think that it needs to be built in on the front end. And it's something as simple as asking this, the terms of your scholarship is that you will receive a update for the, X number of years after your graduation date. We ask that you commit to responding to this survey, because this is how we're going to see also about whether they ultimately get licensed. Although we could also do that by doing a CPA look, a CPA verify lookup or an Oregon lookup. And also collecting a non-university email. So asking the students for their most permanent non-university email. So that's those are really the types of tracking we can do. But that's it that I think we've come up with on this committee.
This also gives me thoughts around the cohort model that we are looking at here. I think it'll be easier for us to make claims around actually generating incremental students if we can track them all the way through finishing, in that they have to make progress in order to continue to receive the cohort scholarship. So I think that would help us a bit. We might be able to say, 80% of our, students make it all the way through, and then the Oregon State, the population for university students or community college students, only 60% finish.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
So I think what we heard from the board was no endowment. My recollection was they were pretty okay with this idea of cohort, but we never got that they were okay. We never got to the dollar amount. And I don't know what the committee's thoughts are on the dollar amounts here. There was one individual present at the meeting. It was actually a staff member. Right, Martin?
Yes, correct. One of my staff, yes.
One of your staff who shared her personal experience, very strong feelings based on her children's experience through college, that they believed there was that more students were inclined to apply for more modest scholarships, somewhere in that 2,500 range. That when you started having really big scholarships, students would count themselves out. I don't know, I'm not close enough to know if that is accurate or not. But what we do want to ensure is that we have a robust applicant pool. So I would open it up for thoughts on this too.
We absolutely see this reluctance at OSU for applying for the really large scholarships. There's a smaller pool, strangely enough.
Okay.
And so that rings true to me.
Okay. What do you think describe as small versus large? Because we're looking at 2,500, 3,000, 5,000.
This was a $10,000 scholarship. Yep. Is our kind of like top level. Yep.
Madam Chair, when I put the schedules together, and I forwarded Martin, and you had seen this, I didn't even go below $2,500 because I thought that becomes insignificant at that point. Now, that being said, there is the option of making them even $1,000, options. But to that point of what's gonna attract the most attention and attract the most applicants, I have no input. I didn't pick anything under 2,500 because I thought it was too insignificant.
Cynthia and Claire, what are your thoughts around that and Chris, from your experiences at your universities?
I think mine would, sorry, go ahead, Claire.
I was going to say my internet cut out, so I dropped the call for a few minutes, but we're talking about size of and magnitude is that I think for our students, anything below 2,500 would be difficult. I mean, they would take a scholarship for less, and we've granted scholarships for less, but for them to go through an application process, I think 2,500 would be a, kind of a reasonable starting point. One question I do have is I'm looking at this schedule now that I can actually see it. I'm not driving. Is we're looking at first year students. So is there going to be like our students, for example, don't declare a major until their junior year. So they only have 2 years that they would be able to be eligible for this scholarship. So are we accounting for differences if a student were to apply and they only had 2 years of eligibility? Would they just get less money, or than the student who had, from freshman to MAC, if that makes any sense? I don't know if that's something that we've talked about yet, but as we were talking and looking at this, it's just something that came to mind as well.
We have not discussed that.
Although the third tab, for example, Claire, I believe it's the third tab, 2,600, 26 people, well, a couple tabs over. I did build one with just 2 years based on your comment that you had made at committee that maybe they only had declare with 2 years to go. But it does that only, again, that was just a potential option to be looking at this point. So, but your point is good. Not every university is going to be handle it the same way, because they may have some right from the get-go and some only declare in their last 2 years. And with the potential change in model that maybe it's 4 years and 2 years of experience, there aren't going to be 5-year cohorts. Maybe it'll be a 4-year cohort to get an accounting degree that allows you to sit through the exam. So there's a lot of variables out there. Absolutely agree.
Cynthia?
Well, I think I'm a little bit of a disadvantage for understanding the full experience for students, because 2,500, 3,000, 5,000 is very significant for a community college student. The big challenge that knocks a lot of our students out is those last 2 years at a university. So I feel like all those would be very great options for community college students and have a significant impact. But understanding it's what comes later is really the tough part.
I guess this is a question probably for Martin and for Logan. How much does this committee, how much of a recommendation do you think, Logan, the board is looking for from us? Oops, sorry. I'll repeat that.
The visitor. Yes, sorry.
Sure. How much of a recommendation do you think the board, how specific of a recommendation do you think the board is looking for from us? And then from Melissa and Martin, how specific do we need to be in this contract? I guess what I'm trying to decide is how much guidance do we need to be making a recommendation on to go into this contract?
I hesitate to speak for the board, but my best guess is that high specificity would be preferred.
Okay.
I think the board would ideally have just like, here's this one plan. Do you like it or not? You know, and that simple yes or no. You know, if it's a no, we can redraft. But I think the board is probably in the mood to just make a decision versus like differentiating between different scenarios. Martin, what do you think?
I actually, just from a dynamic standpoint, I completely agree with your sense of that.
Well, one thing, if the more specific we make it, then that also ties us to it. You know, you have less flexibility down the road if we want to make a change. But I get it. If that's what they want, then that's what we do.
Melissa, did you have, yeah, I saw you unmuted.
Sure. Yeah, if you would like me to weigh in. So one thing I would sort of just lay out for you all in thinking about this is that this is a grant. So this is a grant. It's the one reason why I'm here instead of Karen. Rather than a contract where, for instance, you're hiring an entity to hand out these scholarships, you are giving money through a grant to the other entity to hand out the scholarships. You can include, you know, criteria in that grant agreement about how the scholarships shall be structured. Or you could leave it to the grantee, at least some flexibility. But the difference really between the really bottom line difference between a grant and a contract for services is that when you hire somebody in a contract for services, you're much more involved in how they do something. Whereas when you're granting funds, it's really, you have an agreement and you say, you grantee, here's the agreement, here's the funds, and really what we're looking for is the result. And we're not going to be as involved in monitoring, you know, how you do it on a daily basis kind of thing, where you might do that with, you know, a vendor that you hire or somebody that you hire to do, you know, perform personal services. So that's just something to think about too.
That's super helpful. So as you were talking, the way I'm hearing that translate into this particular situation is it probably would make sense to do the grant and to specify this is current spend. This is not to go in an endowment, because that is very clearly, I wish the board, that's a very top level administrative decision. And then also obviously the financial need subject to some minimum threshold and I think, I mean, I'm probably just saying financial needs subject to a minimum threshold of academic performance. And that's something that or OSCPA can decide. And then also renewable. So the renewability, because that's, again, a big theme that the board seems to have gotten behind. And then the dollar amount maybe is one that we don't weigh in on. I don't know. Or do we put a range? I'm curious just where we're at with what other thoughts are. And I see Sherry, your hand is up. I'd like to recognize you.
Thank you. And Melissa, I really appreciate you weighing in on that. Or yes, you weighing in, I'm making sure I have the right image up in front of me so I can't see everybody. Weighing in on that, because I do have some questions about that related, and I recognize I'm a guest too, and I'm only speaking up because we're in work session. So I do have some questions about that, because some of the pieces that you were describing, grant versus more the specificity and contract, that makes sense to me that grant side, if you're using that definition more based on the conversations we've been having all along. So I was feeling slightly confused that we were going down a very specific contract direction, which seemed like that was out of step from where we've been talking these months. And so what I'm hearing you say also is that with the grant, with the contract, there's so much specificity that we would be locked in. With the grant, if we were 2 years into this and we're like, oh, we want to make an adjustment in this, maybe we're getting board feedback, the board is providing that to us from the survey we're doing, that sort of thing. With the grant, we could come back and make some adjustments as an organization on as like Ed Foundation on how that would be given. So for example, in the contract, if it says 2,500, but 2 years from now, if it's in a grant, we could say, okay, maybe there's a desire to move that up to 3,500, for example. That's what I'm hearing.
Would you like me to respond to that? Yeah.
Please, yes.
Not exactly.
Okay.
And I want to make clear, I'm distinguishing between a grant and a personal services contract. Both a grant and a personal services contract are contracts. So unless you amend the contract, amend the agreement, even if it's a grant agreement, then you're bound by whatever the agreement says. But you know, there's certainly lots of options. You can make the grant agreement for 2 years. So you have time to, you know, like then look at it again and make sure you want to keep funding it in the same way. That's an option. You can put some flexibility into the grant agreement itself and say, you know, if these things happen, then, you know, the parties agree that they'll, you know, come back together or amend the agreement or do something different. But you have to put that into the agreement if that's something that you want to do.
I think where I'm confused, and I'm not being disagreeable, so please don't think that, anybody. When we were first talking about this, and this doesn't matter whether it's OSCPA or anybody else, we just happen to have agreed that we would, you know, work with the board if the legislation's approved to provide scholarships out, since we do that already, right? But I mean, this could be anybody. I just remember conversations about the board really isn't, how do I say it? Because they have another entity giving them, they can give guidance, but it's not the specificity of you know, like dotting all the I's and crossing all the T's of, you know, exact amounts and I mean, all kinds of things like that. So I'm feeling a little confused is all, which is why I'm asking the questions.
And I think some of that is my fault. We prepared these projections and presented them to the board so they could understand the scope of what this could accomplish. And then I have taken this down the road of trying to, I think erroneously, of how much specificity do we need in the contract. And I think Melissa's comment has been very helpful, that in explaining that we probably don't need the level of specificity that I had thought we did. So as broad principles that this task force laid out at the request of the board, we absolutely talked about financial need driving this with just some guardrails around, you know, you don't want to be giving it to somebody who's barely passing their classes, right? So some guardrails around that. And Melissa, if you could, when I'm done with these, weigh in on whether that sort of, whether this is the level of specificity that is appropriate in the grant. Financial need, renewability, no endowment. Do all of those seem to be the level of guidance that seems reasonable for a grant, Melissa?
Absolutely. And again, you know, I think you can have various levels of specificity about how you want the grant to be implemented. It's really more a difference of it's you put it in the grant and then you sort of step back and let the grantee do the program.
So maybe,
essentially.
yeah, maybe that is just letting the board of the board of the foundation make the determination about how many years, how many scholarships, and the dollar amounts. Or do we want to, as a task force, put some suggestions around ranges, for example? I don't know the answer to that. Scott?
Well, Madam Chair, I guess, I mean, we're struggling right now with what the Board of Accountancy wants us to do. And it sounds to me like we would then boot it to the foundation to figure out what to do. Yet there's reporting requirements back to the governor's office based on specific requirements they would like of that. It just seems to me that we're going to need to put some specificity, whether it be into a grant agreement or a contract, because we're going to be reporting it's public money. We want to make sure that it's being spent in proper ways. And I think granting that authority to the OSCPA Educational Foundation, as wonderful as they are, I don't know that's a proper use of public money. And it just seems we need to come up with some specificity in whatever the document is, I think. And I think the foundation board would appreciate that too. Just as we struggle with what our Board of Accountancy wants, they're going to struggle with what the government agency wants, my belief.
Sherry and then Melise.
Okay, this was very helpful, and I appreciate us having the conversation where we're retouching on this again, freshening it up. Thank you.
And I do want to clarify, actually, grants often have deliverables. So you can specify in a grant that, there has to be reporting back. That's absolutely fine. But because that's an outcome, you're not necessarily telling them every single day how to do something, but you can absolutely request that there be reporting on outcomes, that you have certain goals met or things like that. Those are all absolutely things you could put in a grant agreement.
But does that include things like the funds shall be expended over a period of X to Y, and the dollar amount of the scholarships will be from A to Z, whatever it is?
Yeah, absolutely.
It could include that
have
range.
that level of specificity. Yes.
Okay. I think we're getting somewhere on this then.
And one other thing I wanted to mention, that at least the way the draft legislation is drafted right now, has authority for the board to establish by rule the eligibility criteria for the program. Also. So that, and that might be something to think about doing, if the board is going to do rules before we start drafting a contract that has to comply with those rules. That might be something to think about too.
I think what might be helpful is between after this meeting and before the next meeting, if I could do an offline conversation with you around kind of just laying out something we can bring to the next committee about, this is the type of example of what happened at the level of rulemaking. This is the type of example that at the level of detail that can happen at the level of the actual grant agreement, right? Just so that we can kind of get that clarity for the committee. And I think that will be a partial foundation that stays away from the more substantive question that that I think Scott raised around, hey, I think we actually need to have some level of detail of what goes in there so that we're not guessing about what the ask is, essentially, with respect to this money. And I think then we can put the two elements together, both what's the substantive position, what's the substantive element that needs to go in there, and which part needs to go into rule and which part needs to go into the grant agreement, and get some greater clarity on that.
Yes, absolutely, we can do that.
I've lost track of who raised their hand first. We have Sherry, Claire, and Scott.
Pick one.
Scott, why don't you go ahead?
Okay, so maybe I want to make sure I just heard something properly, is that as the legislation is drafted, I guess I did not see that, but did I hear you say that the criteria could be changed by rule by the board? Is that correct? For issuing the scholarships? It's a multi-phase question here.
The legislation as drafted says the board may by rule establish the eligibility criteria for the grant program.
Would that be eligible to be changed year to year?
Certainly the rules could be changed. The contract, not necessarily.
Well, to the extent that it's, because what I'm thinking of is as we see this play out and we see that it's attracting attention, not attracting attention, we're not getting the results we thought we want, we're not meeting the diversity goals, could the board then say, okay, this year we want the scholarships to be granted on this basis, which was different somewhat from whatever has been for the last couple of years? Could that be built into the grant agreement, that the board reserves the right then to change year to year what the granting criteria are?
We would probably have to look at that and see how if we could fashion it to do that.
Because that certainly would
It's a
give us
little
the flexibility then to be responsive to what the needs are and what we see, what level of results we're seeing from it.
Claire?
So this is just a clarifying question for me as we're at the end of the semester and my brain is mush. Just to understand kind of the org chart of the different organizations. So the Board of Accountancy, are they the final authority decision making, and then the foundation is facilitating the choice of recipient of scholarship? Just I'm trying to figure out what each organization has a responsibility and authority for. And this is just for me to understand in my own brain if that's something that could be explained. And sorry, that's a stupid question.
Not at all. Martin, do you want to handle that?
I'm not sure that I followed the question. Sorry.
Well,
That's okay.
I'll give it a shot. And if I've misspoken, you can correct me. So the role of this committee is to make a recommendation to the board of the Oregon Board of Accountancy. And the Oregon Board of Accountancy is then the granting organization. Do I have that right, Melise? Still?
Yes.
Okay. And so the question is, how much specificity will go into that grant or rules? And then the Board of the Ed Foundation will be determining, this is really the question, they'll be determining the scholarship recipients, but how granular will the Board of Accountancy's recommendation be to the foundation? I think that's the crux of our discussion right now.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting question, because my sense here is, and I'm going to look a little bit for help to Logan here as the resident board liaison, right? The only thing that I know for sure is that the board's not going to want to be in a position that every time that we might have to change gears, that we have to do rule writing to change gears. So I think that the starting point for me in terms of an answer is that we're going to try, I think we need to try to get to a type of agreement that allows a level of flexibility that says, hey, this isn't going quite this way. Do we need to change course, without us having to go back and do rulemaking? So that's one kind of selfish thought that I have in there. And at the same time, Logan, my thought is that the board, ultimately the board is responsible to the governor's office for saying, hey, here is what we're capable of reporting as success and tracking under, what happened here through that, what they call a special appropriation of government funds, right? So I do think that the board's going to want to specify saying we need to be able at minimum to report XYZ things in XYZ rhythm. I do think that you can frame that, and I've been blessed with 11 years of work in a nonprofit sector, including a whole bunch of grant writing and reporting. I do think you can do that and still allow flexibility at the level of what in this case would be OSCPA Ed Foundation to say, well, yeah, here's the minimum floor, but it turns out we can also do D, E, and F. And the board may not have asked you for D, E, and F, but we actually have the ability to add this into the equation to make this more meaningful, even more meaningful than the minimum floor that we've set. Now I'll stop there and see if, I don't know, Logan, from your perspective, I see Chris nodding his head, but does that make sense to you, Logan, from a board member perspective where I'm at?
Yes. Yeah. So there's the reporting side, where I think that there would need to be specificity, clarity on what we need to be, justifying, productive use of the grant. Now it turns to how to administer it, right? I think that I could imagine a lot more flexibility there. I would hazard the guess that the board would like ranges versus just, carte blanche, like a $3,000 to $6,000 over 8 to 10 years, these kinds of things. There's some, needs based, all the stuff the chair mentioned earlier. I think that would be probably pretty suitable to the board. I think I would guess that if it was possible within the grant agreement to have something that is modifiable by the board would be nice. But yeah, ranges I think are sufficient too.
Cynthia, I saw your hand up. Did you still have a comment?
I think everyone's kind of converging in the same space, but what I was thinking about is in the nonprofit community where nonprofits are receiving grant money from maybe the state of Oregon for human services, and there's some broad objectives for those grants, and there's definitely reporting requirements for what the outcomes are looking like, but each nonprofit is going to go about it their own way within those guidelines. So I think I was putting my head around it that way. And is that what we're talking about too? Because the Oregon Society of CPAs, they are a nonprofit. They're serving our community. It seems similar to me.
Scott?
So to that point, and grants, and I guess this is a question, we're looking at in probably most of these cases, this is a one-time funding under the granting authority that the funds will be expended over 4 to 5 to 6 years, as opposed to each year, we're coming back for an additional funding at that point. So under the traditional granting, there's the reporting back in that says, okay, we're making it, not making it. And then the granting agency would say, well, we're not going to continue the grant. It's not accomplishing anything here. So this one's going to need to be, I think, a little bit different than that, in that where they've got the money up front, there's going to be reporting, but there needs to be flexibility, it seems to me, as we go, to then change their criteria to make it a successful granting process, because we're going to get feedback that it's not working or it's working beautifully, I guess. So I see that as a little bit different from the normal granting process, in that it's not a continuing report to us and you'll get next year's money. It's like, you got the money, you better spend it properly now, and you need to tell us for sure.
Claire?
This is a two-part question. The first part is, in thinking about the reporting requirements that would be due back to the governor's office, is that something that gets put, and this is a question for Melise, something that gets put in the grant agreement, or is that something that the governor's office has, like, which direction do those reporting requirements go? And then the second part to that question is, do those reporting requirements in any way inform, or should they inform, how the grant agreement is structured? I don't know if that makes any sense to you, those two questions.
absolutely, that's something that you'd want, if that's what you want the grantee to do, we would absolutely want to put it in the agreement. And, you know, it's obviously, these are all policy calls for the committee and the board to decide what level of reporting you want and how you want them to do it, but we absolutely can put it in the agreement, and I would recommend it.
So I think we are at a point where we have a little bit of, we've circled around and we sort of have an understanding about these ranges. Agreed? Okay, so then the question is, maybe I should throw that, what do you think about throwing that spreadsheet back up? Because I think we have, we've handled 4A in our work session. And item B is to develop an actual recommendation amount. So maybe now that we've had this conversation, we can take a look again at that spreadsheet and kind of come up with what do we think is a reasonable dollar amount. So let me pull that back up.
And while you do, Elizabeth, are you asking for a dollar amount, or are you asking for a range of dollar amounts? Like, are we saying, should we say a dollar amount, or should we say it's a range between X and Y?
I feel like there are so many unknowns right now, and as Scott, you pointed out, the pathway to eligibility is changing. We've got a lot going on. So my inclination would be to do ranges, and I think, you know, there's different ways of approaching this too. I mean, we can talk about ranges. Years is another big way to approach this. We could talk about it because we've got 3 variables here, and you change one and it changes the other 2. You've got number of years, a dollar amount, and then that yields your number of scholarships. So we have Cynthia and then Tana.
I was gonna say one of the factors that we don't have in here is attrition. And that's something that the Oregon Society ranges would help them manage, how they could adjust the dollar amount based on that too.
Good point. Tana?
Oh, I just wanted to mention, just throwing it out there, that the OSCP Educational Foundation has just raised our minimum scholarship dollar amount to be $3,000. So thought that might help in the conversation.
Thank you. That's fantastic. That's very helpful. So, and recall too, you know, one of the things that we said, and actually I was looking at my notes just a moment ago, we also specified that this did not need to be full-time students. And if we're talking about ensuring diversifying the pipeline and equity issues, those part-time students are often the ones with the greatest need, because they're working full-time, supporting families themselves and going to school part-time. And I noticed Washington doesn't comment on that. Okay, so if we start, I feel like I'm going to start like an auctioneer here. We're starting at 3,000 as our starting bid here. I do think that's a really helpful piece from Tana. What do you all think about saying as 3,000 as the minimum? So Cynthia, if you had a part-time student taking 2 classes, that $3,000 would cover their whole tuition, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it would. I think I would lean towards the $3,000 minimum and then the range up to 5,000, just to give the board more options, depending on what attrition's looking like and things like that.
I see a thumbs up from Scott. Mary as well. And Mary, I don't know how much visibility you have to scholarships. I don't know why I put you in the Kernet Stokes bucket in my head all the time, and I forget that you're U of O now.
I've been at U of O 3.5 years.
I never said that I was right about that. When I first heard your name, though, it was always Kernet Stokes. Does that feel reasonable for your population, which is kind of, I think of your population and Claire's as the opposite end of the spectrum of community colleges in terms of cost and ability?
I think that's very true as far as being on the other end of the spectrum. And, you know, we have a pretty good amount of a fair number of scholarships anyhow, just from the accounting circle. So I don't see this going towards U of O a great deal. I think most of it's going to go towards junior colleges and maybe Portland State. Not to say that some of the students, you know, don't have a need, but probably not as many. There's several that are working and trying to pay for college while and not racking up a huge amount of debt. But I don't know if they're going to be Pell Grant eligible.
Well, and I moved to the sheet that has that. If you look at Pell Grant eligibility by school, you know, I just did hey, if we assume 15% of eligible students actually apply, those are the numbers we're looking at.
Yeah. And that makes sense to me.
Yeah. And the PCC number is grossly understated because that doesn't capture the way you guys, you know, we talked about that with Cynthia's tracking at PCC, that it's really problematic to try to capture all of them with the way they do their reporting system. So I would expect PCC and the other community colleges to make this number larger coming from PCC. Right. You can see it's, you know, if you look at the eligibility percent, the Pell Grant eligibility percentages, PSU is the highest, next is Southern Oregon, and then PCC, and then you drop down from there.
Yeah.
So other thoughts on the $3,000 to $5,000? Any dissent, any other arguments going another way? I mean, when you look at these different numbers, you know, this was at 2,500. And then we said, let's do, here's 530 of them at 5,000 a piece. There's going to be some variability. And maybe there's some desire on the part of, after looking at the applicant pool, to make those numbers variable, for example, between community college or a four-year institution or a, you know, undergraduate versus graduate. Hopefully we will still have graduate students, even if the pathways change. We hope that students will continue to see the value in that fifth year. But we don't know. I mean, that's a whole nother issue for us educators who have those programs. Okay, so I'm going to throw one more out there. One of the things that's, oh, Scott, go ahead.
Well, and maybe getting ahead of it, but if, you know, providing a range 3 to 5, if that's kind of sounds like where we're coalescing around, would we also then want to say what the maximum and minimum amount per year that would be granted in scholarships?
You mean in total?
Yeah.
I don't think
in theory they could give away all in 1 year. Is that what the board wants, or does the board want to see it over the full funding of a person's education over a 4 to 5 year period? We'd probably need to put parameters on how much per year at the 3 to 5 per recipient.
I think we need to go the other direction because we don't know what kind of applicant pool we're going to get, especially in the first year when this is not well understood. So we could specify the number of years, which gets us to that point. It may be that in the first year, there aren't enough applicants, particularly with the timing of this. We've had some conversation around that the timing of getting the word out there with students is going to be late because we can't really do much advertising until it's approved by the legislature. So if we say that we would like this distributed over a period of 5 to 8 years, or whatever that number is that this committee recommends, that gets us to what you're saying. Just, I think doing it year by year will be problematic because it depends on the number of applicants, if that money can be given away within the dollar amounts we specify.
Got it. Thank you.
So that's the next place I was going to go to, is how many years are we talking about? 4 years ago, even, the world was quite different, right? 5 years ago. Is there still going to be such a high demand in 5 years? I mean, there's so many variables here. So I just want to open that up for everyone.
I think one relevant statistic for that question is the percentage of CPAs nearing retirement, which is something like 75%. So I anticipate the demand will be there for these students. So at least on that dimension, the demand for graduates, I think, is sound. But what does that do in terms of our timeline? I'm not sure.
This is really for our guests as well, too. Claire, go ahead.
I was just going to say that in part, if we're looking at the length of time over which scholarships would be granted writ large, in part, it also depends on what the renewability parameters are. If it's a renewable for up to 4 years, renewable for 2 years, renewable for 5 years, if it's a year by year. So, I mean, I guess maybe it doesn't, it may not affect, I guess maybe it doesn't affect the number of years, but it does end up affecting the number of scholarships that would be granted. So as we're talking about the length of years over which these scholarships would be granted, I would also want us to talk about, and I don't have a thought or a preference, but just the number of years or what the renewability might look like, so that we can kind of think about what's the total impact in terms of the number of potential new folks entering the pipeline, if that makes any sense.
Makes perfect sense. Thank you for pointing that out, Claire. You know, what we don't want to do is have somebody who's dribbling along and, you know, they get 8 years of funding here, because there are people that it takes them 8 years to finish their degree. You're working full time. That's not an unreasonable timeline. So that's a great question. Again, going to the point of how much do we want to specify this and how much do we want to leave this to the OSCPA? Sherry?
Thank you. I think I'm still a little bit itchy about understanding when we talk about that range of 3 to 5. The one thing that need to clarify for OSCPA, we moved our community college up to 1,000 and we moved university up to 3,000. So I want to make sure that I don't step away from the meeting today without understanding whether the 3 to 5 is regardless of where you're going per year, or does it break out differently? Thank you.
And I think in a previous discussion, we talked about whether the funds could be used for just tuition or overall living costs. And we decided it was just tuition, I think, in the end.
Yes.
And so that, you know, that tuition value that can be absorbed by that student would have a role to play here. And it's conceivable there are students that are going part-time who would not even be able to absorb $3,000 of scholarship. So that's complicated.
Does that mean we have a bifurcation? If full-time students get 3 to 5, anything less, a less than full-time student could get up to $2,000 or something like that? I don't know what the numbers are, but is that kind of perhaps an approach?
It could just be
I
a
think
wider
all
range.
of this, yeah, all of this is up for discussion. You know, and from a monitoring perspective too, you know, this becomes problematic if you are saying, you know, a student, I don't know how much monitoring the university needs to do. When a scholarships arrive, a student represents their full-time and then they are not full-time. I know they deal with that with financial aid because students can't drop below 12 credits. I don't know how that all plays out administratively at a university if we were to somehow specify this differently for a part-time student versus a full-time.
In that case, for my purposes, so let's say we fund somebody a $5,000 scholarship, they're a full-time student, we'll keep it at that. During the year or during the period of time they go to less than full-time scholarship and their educational cost becomes less than $5,000. In that case, would the university or the school refund money to that person?
They register term by term.
Okay.
So there's 2 pieces to your question, I think, and Logan, you'll have to help me on this too as well. So if a student registers full-time, they're paying credit by credit, and I believe that is true at all of the public universities, that is on a credit registered. They pay, their scholarship covers whatever it covers, their financial aid covers whatever it covers, and there's some balance that is likely left at the end. If a student withdraws from a class subsequent to withdraws from a class at different points in the term, there are different amounts of refunds that they get. What I don't know is what happens if they drop below, for example, with their federal financial aid, if they drop below 12 credits. I don't know the mechanics of how that works, but I have students tell me they can't drop my class, even though they're bombing it, because they'll lose their financial aid. And there are students that will simply take an F and stop coming to class because they need their financial aid.
Well, I guess my question would be is, could somebody game the system to get a scholarship?
Yeah.
Drop below and then get cash money? And, you know, they've converted it to the personal living expenses versus spending on education.
I don't know the answer to that. Logan, do you? Or Mary or Cynthia, any of the educators?
I think it's a yes, indirectly though. I don't think these funds, I don't think they could take as like, you know, expendable for them personally. But they could result in other funds like financial aid, general financial aid. They could have more general financial aid, and they can use that for personal expenses. So indirectly, yes. But I don't think it's I don't think it's so much a concern for us specifically.
Why? Because it wouldn't, the OSCPA would write the check. Who does the OSCPA write the check to? The student or the school?
Oh, Tana, do you want to? Yeah, it's the school. But
Yeah.
Okay.
If I could just, I'm not sure how exactly it's going to differ with this Pell financial aid grant piece of it. But currently our scholarship program, we're writing the check to the university, and the way our current scholarships are set up is it is for tuition and books. And the university is told that they are to divide it amongst the terms or semesters. And if there's any remaining, if the student ends up, you know, graduating early or drops out or such, in theory, they would be returning the funds to us. There have been a couple of times, I know UVO in particular, we've had a couple students where for whatever circumstances happen and we end up getting money back. That's not all the time, but that has happened.
So any excess is under the current regime with the OSCP Educational Foundation, the schools refund the money to the Educational Foundation with
correct.
Okay, thank you.
It's on a rare occasion, but that has happened.
Yeah, my recollection of that happening when that would get reported at the Ed Foundation meetings, it was almost always when a student graduated early. Cynthia?
Just was going to share some calculations if it would help. Our per credit rate at PCC is $133 a credit. If a student took 4 terms at 12 credits, which is at the low end really of a full-time student at PCC, a lot of them are taking up to 18 credits, shockingly, and working. That would be $6,384 in tuition. I'm estimating they would have upwards of over $1,000 in material cost, textbook costs. That would get them up to close to $7,500. So if you did want to put in at least a halftime requirement, you would know that student would have at least $3,000 worth of expenses. So
that's
that
a terrific decision. Yeah, Cynthia, instead of saying like, you know, different amount, but just specify this is for students taking at least 6 credits. Very few students take less than 6 and have real significant financial need, because
and they're
one
working
class
full time. Yeah.
And this would get students off. I could envision this helping a student who really can only swing one class because they have to work full time, to maybe being able to cut some hours and take 2 or 3 classes. I always come back to, you know, what is minimum wage after taxes? These numbers that feel kind of small at $3,000 are huge when you look at a student in the context of working a minimum wage job. Okay, so I feel like that's a terrific suggestion. Do I hear agreement from that? Thumbs up on agreement? That maybe that's the way to do this? Say at least 6 credits? Or are there concerns on that? Mary?
I just wanted to point out, yeah, the 6 credits makes total sense because they have to pay the fees regardless of how many credits. So it doesn't make any sense to take less than that. Because the fees are significant.
Yeah, we see very few students once they get into a program taking less than 2 classes. That's quite unusual.
Yeah, yeah.
And most of our classes are 4-credit classes at upper division anyway. So they would be looking at 8. So to say at least 6 allows some flexibility in there for some 3-credit classes as well that they have to take outside of accounting.
Right.
Okay, I feel like we're going a little bit in circles, but I'm actually getting some things written down that we're getting agreement on. So I'm quite pleased about that. Okay, so I want to come back to something that we got a little bit off track on, was the number of years. I heard very loudly from the board, push it out fast. So what's realistic here?
Well, the board was also interested in, and I'm going to use phrasing that's probably not quite, funding of person's full educational career. Is that correct?
Yes. Yes.
So
yes,
push it out fast. In context of that is it's at minimum, it's going to be 5 years.
Yep. Yeah, agreed.
And now the pathway may change, but as it stands right now, generally it's going to be a 5-year period, at least.
Mm-hmm. I mean, let's just say and I'm looking at the spreadsheet that we did here on the 30 scholarships at 5,000, which is we're probably not at that. We're somewhere between these 2 different spreadsheets. But if we were to say something like 5 to 8 years, if there was an issue where there was more money than there were more students, greater attrition, for example, that gives the Ed Foundation the opportunity to accelerate scholarships in those latter years. And so what are we thinking? If I were to say, let's start talking about 5 to 8 years as a starting point. What are thoughts on that? We got to start somewhere.
So that would be what we're telling the Educational Foundation Board is to spend this money over a period of approximately 5 to 8 years. Is that I guess what we're trying to decide right now?
Yeah, I just throw that out as a starting point for conversation. And again, with this idea of trying to stick with these general principles that we've been talking about and providing some ranges for the OSCPA.
And using what we're looking at right now on screen is the $5,000 per person per year, 20-30 scholarships. With all the assumptions in place, we're talking about 8 years. It doesn't take into account attrition. Maybe 10 years would be on the other end, between 5 and 10 years to pay it all out in. If at $5,000 per year, if we go 3,000, I mean, again, it's so many. How many variables do we want to add to the process? But I think no less than 5, no more than 10 for sure.
Other thoughts?
I like that.
Logan, what do you think and Martin, since you were both at the meeting with the board? And we can't turn these things on a dime. We're not going to be having any going out till the 26-27 academic year.
I would guess the board might be a little more excited about the 5 to 8 years. I think they'll see 10 years and be maybe a little reluctant to go that far. So your original number, I think, rang kind of true to me. Martin, what do you think?
I agree, if not possibly even stronger, because I think one of the core messages that I took away from the board discussion is that they wanted an impact on the pipeline as quickly as possible. And so the longer you drag it out, right, it becomes a little bit there's a point where it becomes counterproductive again. So I think on the one hand side, they were good with, can we, help somebody make it all the way through, right? And at the same time, I think the length, if we go too far out, dilutes the impact, I think, beyond what I think what the board feels comfortable with. So there's a bit of a tension between the two. So I agree with your take, Logan.
Scott and then Claire.
So the other issue we would need to deal with then is, again, in that there's no accounting for attrition in the models. At the end of the 8 year, there's still money left over in the fund that the foundation is holding for us. Or do we tell them then they need to spend $7,000 or $8,000 the last 2 years, higher than in our 3 to 5 range, so that we fully expend that $1 million? Again, which one's going to be most important? Expending the dollars in a set per amount or a set per year or total year?
Claire?
Just a question, I guess this might be is for Martin and Logan. When you are talking about impacting the pipeline as quickly as possible, are they talking about quantity of new accountants, just in terms of, again, because I keep coming back to in my mind the renewability piece and how long the scholarship is funded? Is it we want more people in the pipeline, or we want, an increase to the pipeline, but we want them to be able to get 5 years of funding or whatever the limit is? And I'm just curious if you have a sense of whether or not the board has a preference for just as like quantity, or more money to fewer people, or less money to more people, I guess is what I'm trying to ask.
That's hard to say, because I'm struggling to think of what would be the most effective way to get more people in the pipeline. It's conceivable a bigger award with less people could actually get more people in the pipeline. So it's hard to say on that. I think, in an ideal world, like this would be like a bunch of students in the next 3 or 4 years that are coming through. That would be ideal. But then we hit up against capacity issues with the number of applicants, right? So there's all these kind of complicated trade-offs, which makes it hard to say there's a clear answer, apart from saying that maybe going 10 years is too long. Apart from that, it's very complex.
Sherry?
Thank you. Claire, that's something that I've been wrestling with myself, and it's not up to me to decide the policy. I'm just going to throw that out there right out, but it almost seems like a blend would be helpful, right? To be able to get some people, like some of the scholarships, be able to get some people to support them all the way through because they might not be able to, and to add some support there. At the same time, that's not as many people, and it's not, Logan, you mentioned the 75%. I see that every day, right? With people retiring. The other part is that early on part where we can impact as many people at one time. Like a blend seems like it would be great, because initially we could give out maybe more scholarships that are not necessarily tied over a long duration, if that makes any sense. Because the other thing that I know is not everybody that receives a scholar, or not everybody that, forget the receiving the scholarship, but not everybody that is necessarily going through a major actually ends up working in the area. And I'm just using that generically, but actually ends up working in the area. And so I worry a little bit about, pushing too much through a funnel, and it's only for a few people. And then if they don't actually go into, accounting, become a CPA, then we're kind of like not really helping as broadly. So I struggle with that and kind of almost wish there could be a blend.
Well, there can be actually. And that's one of the things that I guess I was sitting here staring at these numbers, and for simplicity purposes, these are done showing an even amount every year. And they're showing an equal amount going to each of these quote cohorts. There is no reason why, if we were to say these funds are to be distributed over a 5 to 8 year period at in amounts 3,000 to 5,000, that the OSCPA couldn't say, you know what, based on this applicant pool, let's give preference to all those juniors and seniors and get a whole bunch of them out. You know, that level of discretion is still absolutely there.
And I think
Claire?
it's good for us to talk about, Elizabeth, you know, because we haven't really quite that much.
Yeah, and this is, like I said, this spreadsheet is really, you know, there's simplifications in there. And I mean, you just, of course, you're going to do it evenly across the time period because we don't have enough information to do otherwise. But as the OSCPA, maybe, you know, maybe some of the language, and this is maybe Emily's question, could we say something like, here are the dollar amounts, with an understanding that the intent is to be adaptable to the student, to the population of applicants, with an eye to, and you be using your language, an eye to getting as many students out there as possible, as fast as possible.
Sure, you absolutely can give that sort of discretion to the grantee. I think it'll be important to make sure that if you want a certain outcome, that, you know, that's factored in there too. But yes, absolutely, you can give that discretion.
I didn't realize I was muted. Claire and then Chris.
Yeah, no, as you mentioned, Elizabeth, you were talking about looking at the numbers, and I was thinking the same thing. And is it like a double declining balance type of a situation, or straight line? Which one makes more sense? And so I was kind of having that same thought as to whether or not it would have to be the same amount every year, or if it might make sense to give them the discretion to, or build in the some way for them to accelerate the funds if they want to spend it as quickly as possible to get people in the pipeline. It might be good for them to have the ability to give more upfront. So just, I was kind of thinking about that. Does it make more sense to accelerate it, or give them the option to accelerate it versus straight line over a certain number of years?
I mean, theoretically, if we had enough applicants, all of the scholarship recipients could be determined in year one. And then you fund them out over the remainder of their education. And as you have attrition, you would be able to each year add a few more, but the rest of them would just be renewable. I mean, you know, if that's something we're interested in, I mean, it seems like we could do some kind of guidelines to that effect. I don't honestly think we'd get enough applicants to do that in 1 year, but there certainly might be in 2. Chris?
Yeah, I think Claire stole the words right out of my mouth. I was trying to figure out from a pipeline standpoint, does it make sense to fund juniors and seniors? They're already in the pipeline, already committed. I like the idea of the funding up front and funding throughout. If the goal is to bring new people in, starting with first year students makes a lot of sense.
What are folks' thoughts on that, with a preference to students earlier in their program? Again, this is giving principles to the Ed Foundation, but letting them figure out how to operationalize it given the circumstances each year.
Well, one of the concepts of changing the pathway is that cost of that 5th year of a master's degree. If we're just going to fund them the first couple of years, are we addressing the concerns that people have that 5th year is an impediment? because it costs money to get that 5th year and they're not earning money. So there's a counter argument is, do we fund the back end of it?
Logan?
I think
And then
Sherry
Sherry?
beat me, but okay. Sorry, Sherry. So not to just make things more complicated, but to address that Scott's point about 5th year, we can choose. We could choose recipients as like a 1st year or sophomore, but then the funds could come when they actually are, enrolled in upper division accounting coursework or something like that. Like there could be ways to both like to get people early, but then to make sure the funds are being used to progress and to cover that 5th year or whatever. So that's maybe an extra complication to throw in there, but just there's different ways to do that.
I'm not sure our systems could handle that very well at the universities. I don't know. It's a great question. It sure would add a lot more administrative layers to the OSCPA of tracking that. Sherry and then Mary.
I think we need to also be careful because when we're talking about juniors and seniors, that we're keeping in mind that both that combination of community college and university. So just kind of throwing that comment out there. So we're careful in how we would end up with this in our agreement or grant. Thank you.
Mary?
Oh, okay. I may have already covered this, but yes, I think we absolutely need to do the junior college, and I think they need funding there. But it also, I think that the university, when they're doing those 2 or 3 higher level courses, that's when they really need more money too. So, I mean, U of O and OSU are not cheap, neither is Portland State. So, getting them, maybe starting with $3,000 for the first 2 years in junior college, and then bumping that up to $5,000 in the last couple of years, just to keep them engaged.
This is really, really thoughtful, important conversation, but I keep coming back to what our agenda was for today, which hopefully if I switch this, you guys can see that, which is coming up with some specific recommendations. And I guess this is probably mostly for Logan and Sherry. Could we coalesce around some broader guidelines that would allow the Ed Foundation to have these nuanced conversations themselves as they watch the licensure pathways change, as we see what happens with, I think be fairly call this, see what happens with the master's programs at the different universities. Enrollment could plummet. And this programs may not be able to justify their master's degrees anymore. I think there's conversation nationally around some of that. So what are you all thinking about just coming up with some broad guidelines and some language around that the Ed Foundation should be mindful of changing market and educational conditions and adapt the scholarship dollar amounts and timing of scholarship grants to prioritize addressing the pipeline issue earlier rather than later.
Martin, was that you?
It wasn't me.
Okay.
Well, Sherry and Logan.
Sorry. Sorry, Sherry. You want to go, Sherry?
No, go ahead, Logan, please.
So to be clear, you're suggesting even dropping like the range part of this and being very general?
No, I think
No.
a range. I'm uncomfortable with not having some kind, I think the board might be uncomfortable without some kind of a range, but
Yes, good.
coming
Okay.
up with some language, because those spreadsheets, like I keep saying, the spreadsheets were done assuming a straight line. And I love Claire's analogy there. Why don't we double declining balance this?
There you go.
If we could, let's push more out sooner. But we don't know the actual dollar amounts and number of scholarships that would be realistic. Given this isn't even going to roll out. We're coming up with this language for the contract, the grant contract now. We don't even know what's happening with the whole pathway issue yet. We don't have resolution on that in Oregon or nationally. So we're trying to do, I feel like we need to build in just some really broad guidelines.
Yeah, I think that, well, as a background, I think there's a lot of, trust and respect with the OSCPA and on all their organizations therein, including the Ed Foundation, on the part of the board. And I think board members would be receptive to giving some significant leeway to the Ed Foundation and allocating the awards. So I don't think that would be an issue. Again, curious what Martin thinks.
I agree.
Jumping in, I would say, I appreciate that, Logan, and we've worked hard for that to be the case. Not speaking on behalf of the Ed Foundation, but just thinking about this from a staff perspective, right? I think that it makes sense to have some parameters there. I like the idea that they could be flexible, but I feel like the Board of Accountancy would be, more or likely more comfortable if there are some parameters, so it's not kind of this free for all, right? And if there was, just say I hope it doesn't happen, but there was some discontentment. I could see if it's just wide open, free range, right? That's where discontentment could occur versus having something that's more goal oriented from the board, from the committee going to the board, from the board, and then something that the Ed Foundation could strive for. And at the same time, I like the fact that we've been talking about these areas that they're not like free range, but they give enough flexibility to be able to adapt, and yet there are some guardrails there. I think that safety is important for the Ed Foundation side of the house as well as the Board of Accountancy.
Well, and reporting back to
Correct.
the governor's office.
Yes.
Yeah. Scott?
So to your question of recommendations range, it sounds like we're saying 3,000 to 5,000 over 5 to 8 years, between 30 to 40 scholarships a year. Is that sufficient analysis of what we're looking at and recommendation?
I would prefer not to say a number of scholarships per year, because that precluded front loading the scholarships as much as we are able to with the applicant pools in the first couple of years.
Okay, 30 to 70 scholarships. I mean, because in theory, they could give it all away in 1 year. That's not.
No, because if we say 5 to 8 years, no.
But okay, well, okay, true. If we lower into 5, that's correct. Okay, sorry, yes, correct.
Cynthia?
So just what I was thinking, and Scott just said too, is the 3,000 to 5,000, up to 5 years of funding for a student, 5 to 8 years life of the program, no endowment assumed, and then the 6 credit requirement. Those were some of the things we were kind of converging on, weren't we?
Yes, that's correct. Exactly. Yeah. Other thoughts? I like what Cynthia just said. So I'm going to summarize that one more time, make sure we have that down. I know the whole thing's getting recorded, but it's such a pain to go back and look at a recording. So no endowment, renewable scholarships up to 5 years. Financial need at least 6 credits, so just a student who's pursuing at least 6 credits, 5 to 8 years of scholarships on tuition and books only, with a preference to front load the scholarship money in the earlier years. Have I missed anything? Then we have to, if everybody's okay with that, I think that feels like a reasonable thing we could write up as a proposal. We can also, Martin, can we also do a draft of some of this? No, we can't circulate it. I keep forgetting that. We're not allowed to do that.
Yeah, I was about to joke with you, this committee has unlimited powers, but those do not extend to violating public meetings law. I mean, we can't do it. So yeah, no, we can't kind of discuss and edit a document offline.
Right.
Of the committee.
So this gives us a range of dollar amounts, a range of number of years over which the funds should be distributed. It includes this whole notion of we want to front load it because the pipeline is a problem now. We don't know if it will be a problem. I mean, I'm saying this facetiously, but AI could take away all of our jobs, right? I mean, there's a lot of things that could change between now and, getting rid of, if the 5th year is quote gotten rid of, who knows? We might have a ton more students who want to pursue a CPA. That alone could be fixing a lot of this problem. We just don't know. What we have not, I feel like this has given us enough information around the guidelines that need to go into the document that Melise will be helping draft. We can summarize, Melise, you're on there. I can summarize too a little bit of this for you and send it to you directly. I believe that's allowed. Yeah. And then the other piece of this, as I'm looking at the clock, it's 3:38. We talked about the data that needs to be reported back to the Board of Accountancy, so that it can be so there can be feedback given to the governor's office. Melise, how should that have the same level of specificity or more that we've been talking about?
I think it should.
Okay. So if everybody's okay, I would like to use our last bit of the meeting to come up with a list of that data. If we could brainstorm that data that we need, I think that would be tremendously helpful, so that Melise can get going on a first draft of this document. Scott?
So one of the things we're talking about is needs-based, which we're at this point describing as Pell eligibility, Pell Grant eligibility in year 1. And we're going to fund them for their full 5-year career, perhaps, educational career, whatever, 5-year, 4-year, whatever it is. At the schools, do they can annually report their Pell eligibility or submit information to determine if they're Pell eligible? What if we have a situation in year 1, they're Pell eligible and they're not after that? We need to gather that information.
Well, I want to be really clear. We're going to specify financial need such as Pell Grant eligibility, because there needs to be a little bit of a buffer in there, because financial need, that's a hard line with the Pell Grant eligibility. And there's a lot of students out there that don't hit that, and they still have a great deal of financial need. So I think that is a question, though. So I know I just want to make sure we're using Pell Grant eligibility as shorthand for financial need.
Right, and then the idea being is we're going to grant them their full career funding, but we do need feedback that they continue to have financial need over those 4 to 5 years, not just.
Yes, and I think that's something that the renewal that there should be specificity on the renewal. If there's continued financial need and progress, I'll add that to my list, that renewals, because the students aren't going to get 5 years at once or 3 years at once. They're going to have to have the OSCPA is going to have to come up with some kind of mechanism for these students, like a fast pass application. And there may be students who just for some reason don't apply again. So, I mean, this is going to have to be on the students, that they need to apply again and indicate financial need. Let me just add that to my list. Okay, are we, anything else before we shift to the data to be reported back? Okay, data to be reported back. I'm going to start with the easy ones. The easy ones are descriptive statistics, so demographic data on the applicant pool. And demographic data on the scholarship recipients. So when I say demographic data, I'm referring to sort of standard gender, not a binary gender. I'm guessing that's already in the application. Race. What else are we asking for? Pell Grant eligibility or not? Because that's something we can measure and compare to our population. Claire?
I was just going to point out that I don't know whether or not the scholarship applications give an option for folks not to disclose if they choose not to disclose. I'm thinking about, you know, a lot of different students who may not want to disclose some of that information. So if is the scholarship contingent on them identifying and sharing gender identity, so it would be okay if they didn't, like, this would not be a requirement. I just want to make sure that that's the case, so they can opt out if they choose.
I don't know about that. Sherry or Tana, can you address that?
I'm not sure either, but I know, I mean, everything you see has that other box of, you know, not wanting to. We will have to check.
Our current scholarship program, it's an optional. The way our program is structured, we say that ethnicity and gender section is optional based on some scholarships awarded potentially. So it's optional.
I'm thinking based on what Claire's saying, you know, it's more of a privacy issue even versus, I mean, thank you, Tana, even versus our current application.
What I'm going for is we want to be able to compare your applicant pool and the scholarship recipients with with our populations at our different universities. That's that's how we can report this back.
Understood. Thank you.
So there will be a small number, I'm sure. I mean, when I get our data, I have a small number who prefer not to answer. Usually 1 or 2%. It's quite small.
So we don't have it as a required. So we don't have it as a required field. Maybe
no, it's not a required field.
No, it's optional now.
Yeah.
What else are we looking for, folks?
We've mentioned first generation status yet?
Should include that. Yep.
Is disability?
Please.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, great.
I just had a question. What do you mean by that last? Because I'm trying to write these down to make sure
Oh, yeah, Melise. So first gen college student. Yes, we have that in our databases at the universities.
Okay.
Yeah. So I don't know who said disability status. Good call. Veterans. Scott, what else?
So a little different track, but still on point. I mean, the whole goal was to fill the pipeline ultimately with CPAs as well as the diversity piece. We probably want to make sure they still intend to become CPAs as they get through their junior and senior year. As they renew their scholarships, are they still intending, granted, no guarantee, are they intending to go into the public accounting area?
I made a note of that in the first bucket, not in the second reporting back, because that goes to what needs to be in the renewal application.
Well, but it's reporting back to the governor's office that we are in fact putting people into the pipeline to become CPAs, not just accountants.
Yes, correct. Correct. Presumably, if they answer that question and they say no, they don't get a scholarship. So they no longer become a scholarship recipient. Claire and then Logan.
I was just going to ask Melise if there is typical, like, is there certain types of information that is typically included in agreements like this that the governor's office would want to receive? Because that might also be helpful as we're crafting this.
I can take a look at some of our other grants. I know like the Higher Education Coordination Commission does grants. I don't know exactly what's in their grants as far as, you know, what they specify as far as reporting. But I can definitely take a look and we could, you know, get some ideas from that sort of thing.
Logan?
We want to know maybe ESL status, like language, you know, I don't know if that's
Oh, that's a great idea.
handy. Might pick up some.
What was your first language spoken, you know, was your first language spoken something other than English? Yes, that's actually fabulous.
That would be great.
We don't have that information at the university though, just so you know.
Would that be listed as native language?
I think when I've seen that question asked, I have seen it asked as, what was your first language spoken, or sometimes they ask you at home, what language do you speak at home?
Okay.
So either first language spoken or at home.
Thank you.
I've actually been asked that in a medical setting.
Elizabeth age.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just be honest that just from my perspective, the much more precise version is first language spoken rather than language spoken at home. So you can get to a lot more variables around why that is. And I think it's better from a strict data analytics standpoint to simply ask what the actual applicant is, the actual applicant for the program actually, you know, were they actually speaking a different language other than English first? See, other stuff can have other factors attached to it. And I just think from a precision standpoint, I prefer the first language spoken piece, but that's just me.
That's great. Thank you. Scott?
So just to make sure, this is information we're going to gather every year. Is that correct?
We're asking for this information, therefore it must be embedded in the application process at the OSCPA.
But we're going to get this information each year from that person.
No, I don't think that's what I heard. I think what I heard, and this may go back to a prior committee meeting, is that essentially initially we need to get all of that data. But I think what I also heard the committee in prior meetings talk about is that when it comes to kind of a streamlined renewal process, is that one of the more obvious things is that we wouldn't re-ask them their demographics data, because hopefully their age and whether they spoke a different language would not change from year to year.
But some of the other items would.
Correct.
So whether it's how they identify their financial needs, I mean, that could change dramatically in 5 to 7 years.
What I had initially thought was on the renewal, we're asking them about continued financial need, continue as an accounting major, and continue to intend to be a CPA. I don't know if there's a need to ask them about anything else. Their veteran status is less likely to change. For example, their first language spoken wouldn't, yes, their gender could change, but we've already covered their financial situation. So I think that,
I mean,
yes, it could.
There's a number of things could change in a 5-year period. Granted, there are some things that are veteran status, but we need to be thinking some of these things will change from your initial year of application.
Well,
okay.
The veterans could change because someone could decide to go ahead and enroll in National Guards or something like that.
I think these are going to be fairly small changes, but we can certainly put it in the application. They're all quick boxes to check.
Yeah.
So I did think of one other thing that we have not mentioned that as I was sort of flipping through some other notes here, I realized I had mentioned earlier financial need subject to some minimum academic performance. We have not specified what that minimum academic performance is. And I think there's a question about whether we should be saying that. I think we can say minimum academic performance and leave it to the OSCPA. As long as the Ed Foundation understands that these are needs-based, not merit-based scholarships.
So I have a question about that. We would have to, okay, we would have to be flexible if these were, let's say, high school students applying for their first year, right? Regardless of where, versus if someone's already enrolled in community college or university, then there's some record of their academic performance.
And I would advocate that it should be accounting academic performance. I can't tell you how many students have appalling GPAs in engineering, switch to accounting, and are the superstars.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, obviously if they're brand new, I don't know. I mean, for the academics out there, my gut tells me is it should be something like a C+, B-, like right in that range. Like I feel like maybe a 2.5 in accounting classes is the right number. It's amazing to me. I will just tell you right now, I have a student, obviously I'm not going to name the student, but I have a student right now and they are taking my class for the 3rd time. They have an internship with a Big 4 firm and they have not passed their first intermediate accounting. So I mean, I don't think that 2.5 is too high because I'm saying if you have a 2.5, nobody will hire you. Oh, yes, they will. Scott?
Well, I guess that's premise. Do all community colleges and universities do GPA these days, or is that you get to choose if it's an option or not? Is that going to be a data point that will be there?
That will be available in an Oregon college or university.
So if someone were, oops, sorry, there's hands raised.
Mary and then Claire.
Hi, I see that all the time now that it used to be top tier students were the ones that went to Big 4. Now they're taking C students like crazy. They just need to fill some seats. And they have
a sparkling personality.
They need to have
interpersonal.
Intermediate yet. You know, it's crazy. You know, so yeah.
Claire?
I was just going to say that might be a piece of data that could be in the reporting back to the governor's office would be GPA, might be information that could be useful for them, like accounting GPA or accounting academic performance.
Okay, I added it to the list. So where is everybody at with specifying a GPA, or maybe, I guess just, and I will say, you know, Sherry and Tana, I've been a part of that Ed Foundation board for so many years. I was for so many years. I think it's a very thoughtful board, but it's also a lot of folks that are like A and intermediate or bust. And so I guess my question to you two is, if we were to simply say a minimum level of academic performance, do you feel like that can be adequately conveyed? Or Melise, is there a way of us saying minimum academic performance in the range of in their accounting classes? I guess I have a little bit of fear around that one.
Certainly you could do a range. Yeah.
If we're saying 2.5, we're basically talking about a C+.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like we could convey that, and you know, between Tana and I, Chris is, you know, here also, you know, on the committee. And then, I mean, we can share that with Dave Adams, the president of the foundation. I don't see a problem with.
Yeah, if that's in the agreement, I mean, that would be something we would adhere to. And currently, of course, for the current scholarship program that we have being academic based, it is 3.2 minimum.
Yeah, and that's that's completely reasonable. I mean, if anything, 2.5 I think might be a tad high.
High or too low?
High. I mean, maybe the way that you say satisfactory, I don't know. I guess like, and this is where I'm a control freak. Everybody who knows me knows that. But that's one that for some reason is the one that makes me nervous, because the rest of it, we're giving parameters because of, oh geez, it's 357. The rest of it, we're giving parameters because we don't know how circumstances are going to change, and we don't know how it's going to play out. But this is a judgment-laden thing. Just like we're saying Pell Grant, I feel like this one, maybe we need a little more specificity. At least a C average. Is that language that feels okay? Because then you guys can make a decision. If you say at least a C average in accounting courses.
Which would be a 2-point.
2.0, yeah, on the scale that we use, yeah. Mary?
One thing I wanted to say is that what's happening with students in the past couple of years is they get these offers really early, you know, that they just start, and then their GPA just tanks. And so what the firms are requiring is they maintain a B average. So, you know, I just want
that's the big firms. The big firms.
Yeah, the big firms do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I in thinking about the feedback we get from from members, I can be very confident in feeling that there are a number of firms that would hire folks that have less than a B average.
Yeah, I would agree. And some of those people end up being wildly successful.
Yeah. Some people are just not good students, but they can rock it on everything else.
Yeah. So as I first pass for Melise, can we say at least a C average in their accounting courses? Minimum of a C average. Okay, excellent. We're checking the boxes off. Okay. We are at 3:58. I want to be respectful of time. It feels like we've actually accomplished a lot. Process-wise, Melissa and I have been taking lots of notes. Are we able to come up with a draft and then have that discussed at our next meeting? Is that the way we should be proceeding, Martin and Melise?
Yeah, I think we can do that, because then it's just you and me and Melise working in the interim, and then we're bringing something back to the next committee meeting, and that will not make any hairs stand up from a public meetings law compliance standpoint.
Perfect. If anybody has any thoughts on items that we may have missed, may they forward those to you, Martin?
Yeah, just to me.
Okay.
Please no.
Just to Martin.
Please no blasts to committee members.
So if anybody, as they are having their Friday night beverages or going for a walk or wherever you do your best thinking, if anyone comes up with something, one more thing that we should incorporate here, please send that to Martin. And please, when you do that, specify at what point this is relevant. Is this relevant for the application? Is this relevant for the figuring out how much grant to be provided? Is this relevant to data being reported back? I think that would be very helpful. And Melise, would it be helpful to you if I sent you a quick draft over the weekend of my notes of the important points related to each of those 3 phases?
That would be great. Make sure I didn't miss something.
Yeah, between the 2 of us, I think, or 3 of us, I think we can get it. Logan, anything last as the liaison, as we're now 1 minute late?
No, thank you. Wonderful work. The board will be excited to see what's put forth in front of them.
Okay, this is great. Thank you all. And the meeting is adjourned. The time is 4:01.
super productive, amazing work. Thank you all.
Okay.
Thank